The sun over the Arizona territory was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on a land of baked earth and jagged rock, forging the landscape in a crucible of relentless heat. Here, in the late 1800s, the world was a study in harsh contrasts. Towering mesas of burnt sienna and deep crimson clawed at a sky so vast and blue, it felt like an ocean overturned. The wind, a constant, restless spirit, carried the scent of dust, sun-scorched pine, and the distant, metallic tang of hope and greed that seeped from the mining town of Border Ridge. Border Ridge was a scar on the land, a haphazard collection of unpainted wooden buildings clinging to the edge of what had, for centuries, been the undisputed domain of the Apache. It was a town born of a fever, a gold fever that drew men from all corners of the nation. They were men with calloused hands and hollow eyes, chasing a dream of fortune in the guts of the earth, blind to the ancient history they were trampling under their heavy boots. For them, the land was something to be conquered, to be broken and plundered. But for the people, the ND, this was not just land, it was the heart of their world. Every canyon held an echo, every stream sang a song, and the spirits of their ancestors rode the thermals with the hawks. They lived on the fringes now, pushed back by the relentless tide of settlement and the blue-coated soldiers who enforced it. They watched from the high places. Their presence felt more than seen, a silent, simmering resentment in the shimmering heat. And among them was one who watched more keenly than most, a woman who was a legend before she was even fully a woman. They did not call her by her given name. The white men in town, when they spoke of her at all, used hushed, fearful tones, calling her the Apache giantess. Her own people, a mixture of awe and unease in their voices, called her Tall Moon. The name fit. She stood a full head taller than any warrior in her band, with shoulders broad enough to draw a war bow and arms corded with the muscle of a life lived without compromise. Her face was a map of her heritage and her hardship. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a wide mouth that rarely smiled. Her skin was the color of rich, copper earth, and her hair, black as a starless night, was worn in two thick braids that fell past her waist. But it was her eyes that held the true measure of her. They were the color of dark, polished obsidian, and they missed nothing. They saw the way a lizard skittered over a hot rock, the distant puff of dust that signaled a rider, and the deceit that lay behind a man's smile. Tall Moon rode a paint stallion as wild and untamable as she was, its coat a patchwork of white and deep brown. She rode not with the demure posture of a maiden, but astride like a warrior, her buckskin-clad legs guiding the powerful beast with effortless command. She could track a mountain lion for days, her patience as vast as the desert itself. She could send an arrow into the heart of a running deer from 100 paces, her aim a whisper of deadly precision. She was a provider, a protector, a solitary figure carved from the very rock and dust of this unforgiving land. Her strength was not a gift, it was a shield, forged in the fires of tragedy. She carried the memory of her mother like a stone in her heart. It was a memory of smoke, of shouting in a language she didn't understand, and the bright, terrible flash of brass buttons on blue uniforms. The soldiers had come at dawn, a wave of destruction sweeping through their small, peaceful camp. Her mother had pushed her into the dense scrub of a dry creek bed, her last words a fierce whisper, "Be strong, live." Tall Moon had watched through the leaves as her mother fell, a victim of the casual brutality that was called Tomming the West. Her father, a man broken by grief, had simply walked into the desert one day and never returned. She was 10 years old, orphaned and alone. She had survived. She learned that softness was a luxury, that trust was a fool's game. The world, as she knew it, was divided into two kinds of people, those who would hurt you, and those who would let you be hurt. This harsh lesson was not only taught by the white man. Her own people looked at her with a wary eye, her unusual height, her fierce independence, and her refusal to seek a husband made her an outsider. The other women whispered behind their hands, and the men, intimidated by her prowess, either avoided her or made crude jests she silenced with a single, withering glare. She was a warrior without a war, a woman who fit no mold, so she made her own world in the silent canyons and the whispering pines. Her only companions, her horse and the ghosts of her past. She had made a vow over her mother's unmarked grave. No man would ever break her. She would never be weak, never be dependent, and she would never, ever trust a white man. Into this world of simmering tension and desolate beauty rode Jack Rowan. Jack was a man running from his own ghosts. He was of average height, with a lean, hard frame that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. His face was weathered by sun and wind, a landscape of fine lines around his eyes and a faint, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His hair was the color of dusty straw, and his eyes were a startling, pale blue, the color of a winter sky. They were eyes that had seen too much, and they held a deep, settled weariness. He had been a cowboy, a prospector, and for a time, a mercenary, selling his gun to the highest bidder in the bloody disputes that erupted over mining claims and water rights. That life had left him with a sour taste in his mouth and blood on his hands that he couldn't seem to wash away. The last job had been the worst, a mine owner who paid him to disperse a camp of striking workers. It hadn't been a dispersal. It had been a slaughter. Jack had ridden away that night with his pay in his pocket and a hollowness in his soul that felt as vast as the desert itself. He wanted no more of it. He wanted something clean, something real. He wanted a piece of land, a small herd of cattle, and the kind of quiet that would let him forget the sound of gunfire. He drifted south, drawn by rumors of open territory in Arizona, and found his way to Border Ridge. The town was a chaotic mess of mud, whiskey, and noise. He spent one night in the saloon, listening to the boasts and lies of the miners, and knew he had to get out, away from the press of desperate men. The next morning, he went to the land office, a small, dusty room that smelled of stale tobacco and cheap paper. The agent was a fat, sweating man named Bidler, who looked at Jack's worn clothes and pistol with a practiced eye. "Looking for a claim," he grunted. "No," Jack said, his voice a low rasp. "Land, for a ranch." Bidler's eyebrows went up. Most men who came through here wanted to dig, not to plow. He pulled out a large, hand-drawn map. "Not much left that's worth a damn for grazing. Most of it's dried-up rock. But there is a piece. Up north of town, sits in a little valley. Got a stream running through it. Good water. Nobody's claimed it." "Why not?" Jack asked, his instincts honed by years of sniffing out trouble. Bidler shrugged, avoiding Jack's gaze. "Bit isolated. And the Apaches, they seem to think it's special. Use it for, well, whatever it is they do. Spirit nonsense. But it's government land, titled and clear. Yours for the filing fee and a promise to improve it." Jack looked at the spot on the map. It was away from the mines, nestled against the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The isolation appealed to him. As for the Apaches, he'd dealt with Indians before. You left them alone. They left you alone, mostly. "I'll take it," he said. He paid the fee with the last of his blood money, the coins feeling heavy and dirty in his palm. He wanted to build something here, something that wasn't born of violence. He didn't know that the foundation of his new life was being laid on sacred ground. He spent the next 2 days gathering supplies: a good axe, a saw, nails, flour, coffee, and a small sack of beans. He led his sturdy pack mule out of the chaos of Border Ridge and headed north, the weariness in his soul lifting slightly with every mile that separated him from his past. The valley was more beautiful than Bidler had described. Cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering green and silver, lined a creek that chuckled over smooth stones. The grass was knee-high and lush, and the air was cooler here, sheltered by the red rock cliffs that rose on 3 sides. A sense of peace settled over him, a quiet he hadn't felt in years, He could see it already. A small cabin by the creek. A corral under the shade of the cottonwoods. A few head of cattle grazing peacefully. A place to be. He spent the first afternoon clearing a small patch of ground for his camp, his muscles protesting after months of disuse but feeling good. The honest ache of labor. He set up his simple tent, built a fire pit, and as dusk painted the cliffs in shades of purple and gold, he sat by his fire, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, feeling a flicker of something like hope. He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't hear her approach. It was his horse that alerted him, a nervous snort and a stamping of its hoof. Jack was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively dropping to the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. She was standing at the edge of the firelight, a silhouette against the deepening twilight, but even in the dim light, he could see she was tall, impossibly so for a woman. She wasn't holding a weapon, but she didn't need to. Her very presence was a challenge. As she stepped into the light, he got his first clear look at her. She was magnificent and terrifying. Tall moon. She wore a simple buckskin dress, but it did nothing to soften the hard lines of her body. Her face was set like stone, and her black eyes burned with a cold fire. "You are on our land," she said. Her voice was low and clear, her English clipped and precise, devoid of any accent but that of command. It was not a question or a greeting. It was a verdict. Jack slowly removed his hand from his pistol, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He had learned that much. "This is government land," he replied, his voice calm. "I filed a claim in Border Ridge." A flicker of contempt crossed her face. "Your paper city does not own these mountains. This is the place of our ancestors, a sacred place. You will leave." Jack had dealt with this before, with men whose claims overlapped. A bit of bluster, a bit of negotiation, maybe a few dollars passed hands. He tried to fall back on that familiar script. "Look, I don't want any trouble. This is a big country. There's room enough for all of us." "There is no room for you here," she stated, her voice dropping even lower, carrying a deadly finality. "This is your only warning. Leave by sunrise." A spark of his old stubbornness, the hard-headed pride that had gotten him into and out of so much trouble, flared up. He hadn't come all this way, hadn't shed his old life, just to be run off by a woman, no matter how imposing she was. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his tone hardening. "I bought this land. I'm staying." He expected her to argue, to threaten him with warriors from her tribe. He did not expect her to move. She crossed the 20 feet between them in a blur of silent, fluid motion. Before he could react, her hand shot out and seized the front of his shirt, twisting the fabric in a grip of shocking strength. She wasn't just strong for a woman. She was stronger than most men he knew. She lifted him slightly, pulling him forward until their faces were inches apart. He could smell the scent of wood smoke and wild sage on her. An earthy, clean smell that was startlingly intimate. He looked into her eyes and saw no fear, no hesitation. He saw a well of bitterness so deep it seemed bottomless. "You white men," she hissed, the words a venomous whisper. "You take, you break, you poison everything you touch. You will not poison this place." Anger surged through him, hot and reflexive. No one put their hands on him like this. He grabbed her wrist to break her hold, but it was like grabbing a piece of solid oak. His fingers couldn't even circle it completely. He shoved back, using his full weight, and the move, which would have sent any other person stumbling, barely budged her. It became a raw, physical struggle. Not a fight, but a contest of pure force. He pushed, she resisted. He twisted, she held firm. They were locked together in the flickering firelight. A silent, desperate dance of wills. He was grunting with the effort, his muscles straining. She was silent, her breathing even, her expression a mask of cold fury. In the struggle, his hand slipped from her wrist and knocked against her shoulder. He felt it then, through the soft buckskin, a ridge of old, hard scar tissue. It was a large, jagged thing, the kind of scar left by a serious wound. The unexpected feel of it, the sudden, tactile evidence of some past violence, broke his concentration for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. With a powerful twist, she broke his balance, sending him staggering backward. He tripped over a rock and went down hard, the air knocked out of him. He lay there on his back, gasping for breath, the dust of his new life filling his mouth. Tall Moon stood over him, not even breathing heavily. She looked down at him, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might finish it, that a knife would appear in her hand, but she just held his gaze. The firelight played across her features, and in that moment, the hard mask seemed to crack. He saw past the anger, past the warrior's defiance. He saw a flicker of something else in the depths of her obsidian eyes. It was a profound, aching sadness, a loneliness so vast it mirrored the desert night sky above them. It was the look of someone who had lost everything and was now defending the last, tiny piece of her world. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The mask was back in place. "By sunrise," she said again, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She turned and melted back into the darkness as silently as she had appeared, leaving Jack alone on the ground, his body aching, his pride shattered, and his mind reeling. He had faced down gunmen, dodged ambushes, and stared death in the face more times than he could count. But he had never, in all his life, met anyone like her. He got to his feet, brushing the dirt from his clothes, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had disappeared. He was a man who thought he had seen all the hardness the world had to offer. He now knew he was wrong. He had just seen a woman with eyes as sharp as tempered steel, but he had also seen the ghost of an old wound hidden deep inside them, a wound that made his own bloody past feel like a child's scratch. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he wasn't going to leave. Sunrise came, and Jack Rowan was still there. He stood by the gray ashes of his fire, a tin cup of coffee in his hand, and watched the first rays of light set the tops of the red cliffs ablaze. He had spent the night in a state of restless vigilance, his coat a cold weight on his blanket beside him, expecting a return that never came. The threat had been absolute, the woman's presence as solid and unyielding as the mountains themselves. Yet the dawn was quiet, broken only by the chirping of a canyon wren. He was bruised. His pride was in tatters, but his stubbornness, that hard-bitten core of him that had kept him alive for 30 years, was intact. He was not leaving. From a high ledge overlooking the valley, hidden in a cleft of rock that rendered her invisible to any eye below, Tall Moon watched him. She had watched him through the night, a silent, unmoving guardian of the land he had trespassed upon. She had expected him to pack his mule at first light and flee, as most sensible men would. When he didn't, a strange mixture of anger and grudging respect stirred within her. This man was a fool, but he was not a coward. For the next several days, this became their silent routine. Jack worked, and Tall Moon watched. She saw the way he moved, with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hard labor. He didn't waste energy. He was methodical, building a small, sturdy rock shelter against an overhang near the creek. He set snares for rabbits with a quiet skill she recognized. He was patient and solitary, and this puzzled her. The white men she knew were loud, boastful creatures who moved in packs, their voices and their axes echoing through the canyons, scarring the silence. This man was different. He worked from sunup to sundown, his only companion the rhythmic clang of his hammer on stone or the rasp of his saw through wood. He seemed settled, as if he was not here to tear riches from the earth, but to become a part of it. The thought was unsettling, a dangerous crack in the solid wall of her hatred. Her curiosity warred with her duty. She saw him wash his clothes in the creek, his back bare to the sun, revealing a latticework of old scars that told their own story of a violent past. She watched him sit by his fire at night, staring into the flames for hours, his face etched with a loneliness that felt unnervingly familiar. He was an intrusion, an enemy, and yet there was a quiet dignity to his solitude that resonated with her own. On the fourth night, the land itself decided to test him. A deep guttural howl echoed from the high ridges, a sound that made the hair on Jack's arm stand up. It was answered by another, closer this time, and then a chorus of yips and cries. A wolf pack. They were drawn by the scent of his horse and mule, tethered near his camp. Jack grabbed his rifle, a Winchester .73, and kicked dirt onto his fire, plunging the camp into near darkness. He moved to the animals, murmuring low words of comfort as they stamped and pulled at their ropes, their eyes wide with terror. He saw the shapes then, slinking at the edge of the moonlight. Low, dark forms with gleaming eyes. There were at least 5 of them, circling, testing. He fired a shot into the air, the rifle's roar ripping through the night. The wolves scattered but didn't run far. They were hungry and bold. He knew his pistol would be of little use against a determined pack, and he couldn't afford to lose his animals. They were his entire livelihood. One of the wolves, a large, dark-furred male that was clearly the leader, broke from the circle, charging in a low, silent rush. Jack raised the Winchester, trying to draw a bead in the treacherous light. The horse shrieked and reared, pulling Jack off balance. The alpha wolf lunged. In that split second, before he could fire, there was a sound, a soft, almost inaudible thwump. It was nothing like the crack of a rifle. The alpha wolf yelped, a choked, surprised sound, and its charge collapsed. It tumbled to the ground just feet from Jack, a feathered shaft protruding from its thick neck, the arrowhead buried deep. The other wolves, their leader suddenly and silently slain, froze in confusion. They whined, circling the fallen alpha, before melting back into the shadows from which they came. Silence descended, thick and absolute. Jack stood panting, his heart hammering against his ribs, the rifle still pressed to his shoulder. He stared at the dead wolf, at the Apache arrow. He scanned the dark cliffs that surrounded him, searching for any sign of his unseen savior. There was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the wind whispering through the cottonwoods and the nervous stamping of his horse. He knew who had fired that arrow. He also knew she did not do it for him. She was merely cleansing her land of a nuisance, and he just happened to be in the way. Still, a strange feeling washed over him, the unsettling sensation of being protected by the very person who had sworn to drive him out. The unspoken truce did not last. A few days later, Jack began work on a proper corral. He needed strong, straight posts, and his eyes fell upon a giant, ancient cottonwood that stood alone in the center of the small valley. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, its branches spreading wide like the arms of an old man, offering a vast circle of shade. It was perfect. He spent the morning sharpening his felling axe. As he approached the tree, he felt a strange reluctance. There was an aura about it, a sense of age and permanence that made cutting it down feel like a kind of sacrilege. He shook the feeling off. It was just a tree, and he needed the wood. He spat on his hands, gripped the axe handle, and swung. The blade bit deep into the bark with a resonant thunk. Before he could swing again, she was there. She didn't emerge from the shadows this time. She seemed to materialize directly in front of him, her face a thundercloud of pure fury. "No," she said, the single word as sharp and final as a crack of lightning. Jack lowered the axe, his muscles tensing. "I need the timber. It's the only tree big enough." "This tree is a grandfather," she said, placing her hand on the thick, rough bark as if to soothe it. "It has seen 1,000 seasons. The spirits of this place rest in its shade. Its roots drink from the heart of the mother. You will not kill it." Jack's patience, worn thin by days of hard work and constant vigilance, finally snapped. "Spirits? Grandfathers. It's a tree. I own this land. I bought the paper. That means I own the trees on it, too. Your paper is worthless here. Her voice rose for the first time. Not a shout, but a low, vibrating cry of outrage. It is the ink of thieves and the words of liars. It cannot buy the sky or the water or the soul of a living thing. I'm not trying to buy its soul, Jack retorted, his frustration making him cruel. I'm trying to build a fence. He raised the axe again, more out of defiance than intent. Her reaction was instantaneous. She didn't reach for him or the axe. Instead, she stepped forward and simply stood between him and the tree, her back pressed against the trunk. She spread her arms wide, her body forming a human shield. Then you will cut through me first, she said, her black eyes challenging him, daring him. They stood there, frozen in a tableau of irreconcilable worlds. Jack, with his axe and his deed, representing the relentless march of a new order. Tall Moon, with her faith and her defiance, representing the ancient, sacred spirit of the land. He looked at her, standing there so fiercely, willing to die for a tree, and the anger drained out of him, replaced by a profound sense of shame. What was he doing? He had come here to escape the cycle of violence and taking, and here he was, about to commit another violation, albeit a smaller one. He let the axe fall to his side, its head thudding softly into the grass. He couldn't do it. He couldn't cut her down, and he couldn't cut down the tree she was protecting. He felt a weariness so deep it settled in his bones. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing guard, a solitary, victorious sentinel. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue all morning, began to change. A strange, yellowish-brown haze appeared on the western horizon, growing with unnatural speed. Tall Moon saw it, and her victorious stance dissolved into one of wary urgency. She knew the signs. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange electricity. The birds fell silent. Jack was still stewing in his frustration, measuring smaller pine logs for his corral. When the wind hit, it wasn't a gradual breeze. It was a physical blow. A sudden, violent gust that tore the hat from his head and sent tools skittering across the ground. He looked up, and his blood ran cold. The horizon had vanished, replaced by a roiling, monstrous wall of brown dust that reached thousands of feet into the air. It was a haboob, a desert dust storm, and it was moving toward him with the speed of a freight train. He had seconds. His instinct was to run for the rock shelter, but he looked at the half-finished frame of his corral, the stack of supplies covered by a simple tarp. It was all he had. In a foolish act of desperation, he ran to secure the tarp, fighting the roaring wind that was now filled with stinging sand and grit. Darkness fell in an instant as the wall of dust engulfed him. The world became a suffocating, chaotic nightmare of noise and blindness. The wind screamed, a high, demonic shriek. He could feel the pressure change, his ears popping. He clung to a post of the corral frame, trying to hold the tarp down as it whipped and snapped with incredible force. A loose beam, picked up by the wind, cartwheeled through the air and struck him hard on the side of the head. Pain exploded behind his eyes, followed by a shower of bright lights. His grip loosened, and the world tilted sideways. He fell to his knees, disoriented, the roaring in his ears now inside his own skull. He was going to die here, buried alive in the dirt of his failed dream. Through the maelstrom, a hand grabbed his arm. It was a grip of iron. He couldn't see who it was, could barely register the touch through the haze of pain. He felt himself being dragged, pulled with incredible strength through the blinding storm. He stumbled, his legs refusing to cooperate, and felt himself being half lifted, half carried. The grit scoured his face, filling his mouth and nostrils. The last thing he remembered was being pulled into a narrow opening, out of the direct assault of the wind, before the world went completely black. When he awoke, it was to the gentle flicker of a fire and the muffled sound of the storm raging outside. He was in a small cave, more of a deep rock overhang, but it was dry and sheltered. A splitting headache pulsed behind his eyes. He tried to sit up, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. "Be still," a low voice commanded. He looked over. Tall Moon was kneeling by the small, smokeless fire, her silhouette stark against the flames. She had a strip of cloth and a wooden bowl in her hands. She moved to his side, and he saw that his head was resting on a rolled-up blanket that wasn't his. "You're hurt," she said. It was a statement of fact, not of sympathy. She dipped the cloth into the bowl of water and began to gently clean a cut on his temple. Her touch was surprisingly light, her movements efficient and practiced. Jack flinched as she cleaned the wound. "What happened?" he rasped, his throat raw with dust. "The wind gave you its greeting," she said, a trace of something that might have been irony in her voice. "You were foolish to stay in the open." He couldn't argue with that. He lay back, watching her through half-lidded eyes. The firelight softened the hard planes of her face, casting warm shadows on her high cheekbones. In this small, enclosed space, she seemed less a giant and more human. "You saved me," he said. It was not a question. She didn't answer immediately. Her attention focused on cleaning the wound. "The land does not need your bones to poison it," she finally said, her voice low. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the storm. It was a strange, forced intimacy, two enemies trapped together by a force of nature greater than their own conflict. "Why do you stay here?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost conversational. "There is no gold in this valley." "I'm not looking for gold," he said, his voice still rough. "I'm done with all that. I just want a place, a quiet place." He paused, the words coming harder than he expected. "I've seen enough trouble, caused enough." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She seemed to be weighing his words. "Trouble follows your kind like a shadow." "Maybe," he conceded. "But sometimes a man gets tired of running with it." He thought of the strikers, of the dead faces he tried not to see when he closed his eyes. "I was a soldier, for a time, not the bluecoats, fought for whoever paid the most." He didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe it was the knock on the head, or the strange peace of their shelter. She stiffened slightly at the word soldier. "I have seen soldiers," she said, and her voice became flat and cold, all trace of warmth gone. "They came at dawn. They burned our homes. They did not care if they were killing women or children." It was not a story. It was a scar, spoken into the quiet air of the cave. The simple, brutal honesty of it silenced him. His own bloody past, which had seemed so heavy, felt selfish and small compared to the tragedy she hinted at. He finally understood the source of the fire in her eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was the sacred flame of grief. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a threat or an obstacle, but as a person. He saw the strength that held her together, the immense weight of the history she carried on her broad shoulders. His gaze was filled with a mix of awe, respect, and a deep, aching compassion for the child who had watched her world burn. Tall Moon felt his eyes on her and looked up from her work. His expression made her breath catch in her throat. She was accustomed to being stared at with fear by the townsfolk, with awe by some of the younger warriors, with crude desire by fools in the saloon. But this was different. Jack's pale blue eyes held no fear, no lust. They held a quiet understanding, a shared sorrow that crossed the chasm of their races. He was looking at her as if he could see the broken pieces inside her, and it was more unnerving than any physical threat. She felt a strange flutter in her chest, a warmth that was both frightening and unwelcome. She looked away, back to the fire. He had noticed the scar on their first encounter, but now, with her arm raised as she tended to him, the firelight caught it more clearly. The buckskin had shifted, revealing a long, puckered mark of old, damaged flesh that ran from her collarbone over the top of her shoulder. It was a vicious, ugly thing, an old wound, poorly healed. Without thinking, driven by an impulse of shared humanity. He slowly lifted his hand. His movements were hesitant, gentle. He didn't touch her skin at first, his fingers just hovering over the damaged tissue, as if he could feel the ghost of the pain that had caused it. Tall Moon froze, every muscle in her body going rigid. Her hand stopped its motion, the wet cloth held inches from his face. She watched his hand, this white man's hand, scarred and calloused, as it moved toward the most vulnerable part of her. She should have pulled away, should have struck him, but she didn't. She couldn't. His fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed against the raised edge of the scar. The touch sent a jolt through her, not of pain, but of something else. Something she hadn't felt in so long she couldn't name it. It was just a touch, a human touch that wasn't violent. He looked from the scar back to her eyes, his own filled with a quiet, terrible sorrow. His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the sound of the dying storm. "Who did this to you?" The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than the touch, more charged than the storm raging outside. "Who did this to you?" Tall Moon flinched as if struck. She pulled her arm back, her face shutting down. The brief flicker of vulnerability extinguished and replaced by a cold, hard fury. She rose to her feet in one fluid motion, her height filling the small cave. "My past is not a story for your entertainment," she said, her voice like chipping stone. She turned her back on him and stared out into the gray, swirling chaos of the storm. A silent, rigid sentinel once more. Jack watched the unyielding line of her back, the question he had asked echoing in the sudden, vast silence she had created. He knew he had crossed a line, had touched a pain too raw and too deep for his clumsy compassion. The fragile bridge that had begun to form between their two solitary worlds had just been washed away by the storm. When the wind finally died and a weak, watery sun broke through the clouds, the world outside was freshly scoured and utterly changed. The air was clean and cool, but the valley was a wreck. Trees were stripped of their leaves, and Jack's camp was obliterated. His tent was gone, his supplies scattered, his half-built corral a pile of splintered pine. He stood amidst the devastation, the cut on his temple throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He should have felt defeated. He should have seen this as the final sign to pack what little he had left and move on. Instead, as he looked at the wreckage under the clean, new sky, a strange and unfamiliar feeling took root in his chest. Before the storm, he had been building a shelter. Now, he felt an undeniable urge to build a home. The shared moments in the cave, the terror of the storm, the ghost of her past and the weight of his own, it had all coalesced into a single, stubborn thought. Here, this place, this hard and unforgiving piece of earth, was where he would make his stand. Tall Moon had vanished with the storm, leaving behind only the small fire and the folded blanket she had used as his pillow. He worked for the next week with a feverish intensity, his body fueled by a new, quiet purpose. He salvaged what he could, recut the broken timbers, and began again. This time, he left the great cottonwood untouched. He found his new posts among the smaller pines, dragging them from the foothills until his muscles screamed and his hands were raw. Slowly, painstakingly, a small, sturdy corral in the frame of a one-room cabin began to rise by the creek. His newfound peace, however, was a solitary one. The world outside the valley had not forgotten him. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge, a big man on a big horse, who sat for a long moment looking down at Jack's small operation before riding down. He was Silas Croft, the man who owned the sprawling C-Bar ranch that bordered the valley to the north. He was broad and sunburnt, with a thick neck and small, shrewd eyes. He ran 10,000 head of cattle and held sway over most of the territory, including the local sheriff. "Rowan," Croft said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't dismount. "Heard some squatter was trying to tame this patch of dirt." "I've got the paper on it," Jack said, leaning on his shovel. not bothering to hide the weariness in his voice. Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice near Jack's boot. "Paper don't mean much out here. This valley is my runoff. My cattle water at this creek when the river's low. A fence is an inconvenience." "A man's got a right to fence his own land," Jack replied evenly. Croft's eyes narrowed, scanning the camp before landing on a single, perfect arrowhead Jack had found and left sitting on a stump. His lips curled into a sneer. "I also heard you're getting friendly with the local wildlife. Been seen with that Apache giantess. You'd be wise to remember what color your skin is. Rowan, folks around here don't take kindly to Indian lovers." "What I do on my land is my business," Jack said, his grip tightening on the shovel handle. "This ain't just about you," Croft countered, his voice hardening. "You stir up the Apache. You bring trouble on all of us. They start thinking they can get their land back. That's bad for business. Just some friendly advice. This land ain't worth the trouble you're buying. Pack it in." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving the threat hanging in the quiet air. The isolation Croft spoke of became starkly real a few days later when Jack rode into Border Ridge for salt and cartridges. As he walked his horse down the muddy main street, conversations quieted. Men on the boardwalk stopped and watched him pass, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and hostility. He was the ex-merc, the outsider who didn't drink or gamble with them. He was the fool living on cursed Apache land, and now he was the man who consorted with the mountain monster. The name was spoken in whispers, a term of fear and revulsion that made Jack's jaw tighten. They saw her as a beast, a dangerous anomaly. They couldn't see the woman who had tended his wounds or the sorrow in her eyes. He tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. The proprietor, a nervous man named Fields, served him in tense silence, counting his change with fumbling fingers as if Jack's money were tainted. As he left, he heard one of the store loafers mutter, "Can't believe he's still alive out there. She'll probably scalp him in his sleep." Jack ignored them and walked out, the weight of their prejudice a physical thing on his shoulders. He was an outcast, just as she was. He found her 2 days later, not by searching, but by chance. He had taken his rifle to hunt and was tracking a fine buck high in the rocky terrain above his valley. As he crested a ridge, he saw her below, sitting on a sun-warmed slab of granite, meticulously refletching an arrow. She was so completely a part of the landscape that he almost hadn't seen her. He watched her for a moment, the way her strong, deft fingers worked with the feathers and sinew. He thought about the loneliness of his camp, the silence that was beginning to feel heavy again. He cleared his throat, and she looked up, her hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt. When she saw it was him, her hand relaxed, but her expression remained guarded. Jack felt a sudden, clumsy awkwardness. I shot a buck yesterday," he stammered, feeling like a fool. "It's more meat than one man can eat before it turns. I was making a stew. Figured you might, well, if you're hungry." She stared at him, her obsidian eyes unreadable. An invitation. It was a simple, common courtesy. But between them, it was a momentous thing. He expected her to refuse, to scorn his offer of white man's food. He was already turning to leave when she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That evening, she appeared at his camp as silently as a ghost. She didn't sit on the log he had set out, but squatted on her heels near the fire, her back ramrod straight, a position she could clearly hold for hours. He handed her a tin plate of the stew and a piece of skillet bread. He felt an absurd need to fill the silence. "Almost didn't get that buck," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Slippery old devil. Reminds me of this one time back in Texas. I was working a cattle drive." He launched into a rambling, self-deprecating story about trying to rope a wild steer that had outsmarted him at every turn, ending with him tangled in his own lariat, hanging upside down from a mesquite tree while the steer looked on, seemingly chewing with a smirk. It was a stupid story, one he hadn't thought of in years. He told it badly, fumbling the details, his voice rough. He finished and looked at her, expecting to see the same stony indifference. Instead, something miraculous happened. A strange light danced in her eyes. The corner of her wide mouth twitched, and then she laughed. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a low, throaty chuckle that seemed to come from deep within her chest, a sound of pure, unpracticed mirth. It was like hearing a statue sing. The sound was so unexpected, so beautiful. It struck Jack dumb. He had never seen her smile, let alone laugh. In that moment, the fearsome warrior vanished, and he saw a glimpse of the woman she might have been if her world hadn't been shattered. The sound died as quickly as it came, and she looked down at her plate, a faint flush rising on her high cheekbones, as if embarrassed by the involuntary display of emotion. But the ice was broken. The space between them now held not just tension, but a fragile warmth. The warmth was tested a week later. Tall Moon needed a new steel hide scraper and a proper awl, tools the white man made better than her people could. It meant a trip into Border Ridge, a place she despised and avoided. She chose midday, when the miners were underground and the drunks were mostly asleep. She walked into town on foot, her tall frame drawing immediate stares. Women pulled their children closer. Men stopped to watch her pass, their eyes filled with a crude mix of fear and lust. She had just finished her trade at the general store and was stepping back onto the boardwalk when a voice slurred from the doorway of the saloon. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. It's Croft's pet squaw." 3 men stood there, their faces flushed with midday whiskey. The one who spoke was a burly, bearded man Jack recognized as one of Croft's ranch hands. His name was Cletus. Tall Moon ignored him and began to walk away. Cletus, emboldened by the alcohol and the presence of his friends, stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Where you going in such a hurry, darlin'?" he sneered, his breath a foul wave of cheap liquor. "Ain't you gonna say hello?" He reached out and grabbed her arm. At that exact moment, Jack was leaving the assay office across the street. He saw the confrontation, saw Cletus put his hand on her, and a cold, red rage, unlike anything he had felt in years, flooded through him. He was across the street in a dozen long strides. "Let her go, Cletus," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. Cletus turned, a look of delighted surprise on his face. "Well, if it ain't the Indian lover himself, come to protect your property." "She's not my property," Jack said, his eyes locked on the hand gripping her arm. "And you've got about 1 second to take your hand off her before I take it off for you." The other 2 men chuckled and moved to flank Cletus, their hands dropping to the pistols at their hips. Jack knew he was outmatched. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a public execution. Cletus shoved Tall Moon away and turned his full attention to Jack. "You got a lot of nerve, Rowan." He swung a clumsy, powerful fist. Jack ducked under it and drove his own fist into Cletus's gut. The big man grunted, the air leaving him in a whoosh, but he was built like an ox. He shook it off and bellowed with rage. The other 2 men jumped in. Jack fought back with the desperate, brawling skill of 100 bar fights, but it was no use. 1 man grabbed him from behind in a chokehold while the other 2 used him as a punching bag. A fist smashed into his mouth, splitting his lip and sending a coppery taste of blood across his tongue. Another caught him in the ribs, and he felt a sharp, cracking pain. The world began to spin, the faces of the snarling men and the silent, watching townspeople blurring into a meaningless collage. He was going to die here, in the mud of this hateful street. Then, through the fog of pain, he heard a roar. It was a sound of pure, primal fury, and it didn't come from a man. Tall Moon moved. She was not a brawler. She was a predator. She slammed the heel of her hand into the temple of the man holding Jack, who dropped without a sound. She spun, her braid whipping through the air, and drove her elbow into the throat of the second man. He staggered back, clutching his neck, his eyes wide with shock and pain, unable to breathe. "Cletus!" his face a mask of disbelief, charged her, roaring like a wounded bear. Tall Moon didn't retreat. She met his charge, using his own momentum against him. She seized his arm, twisted, and threw him over her hip. The big man, all 250 pounds of him, flew through the air and landed with a sickening crunch on the wooden boardwalk. His arm bent at an unnatural angle. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. The entire street was frozen in a state of absolute, stunned silence. Men had stopped in their tracks, their mouths agape. In less than 10 seconds, the mountain monster had single-handedly and unarmed dismantled 3 armed cowboys. Jack had fallen to his knees when the chokehold was released. He looked up, his vision swimming, to see Tall Moon standing over the wreckage of her attackers, her chest heaving, her face a mask of cold, lethal rage. But then her eyes found his, and the mask crumbled. The fury vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. She saw him on the ground, his face bruised and bloody, his breathing shallow. The world, which a moment before had been a red haze of violence, narrowed to a single point. Jack hurt because of her. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees in the dirt beside him. He tried to smile, a grimace that sent a fresh wave of blood from his split lip. "Told you, I attract trouble," he whispered, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he went limp. "Jack!" The name was torn from her, a choked, desperate sound. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head against her chest. The townspeople stared, their fear now mixed with awe. For the first time, they saw not a monster, but a woman, terrified of losing something precious. She looked down at his still, pale face, and for the first time since she was a small child, her voice trembled, thick with unshed tears. "Don't you die," she whispered fiercely to his unconscious form. "Don't you die, you fool!" That night, back in the quiet solitude of his camp, the stars were brilliant and cold in the black sky. Jack lay on his cot inside the small, half-finished cabin, drifting in and out of consciousness. His ribs were taped, his face was a swollen mess of bruises, and every breath was a sharp intake of pain. Tall Moon sat on a stool beside him, a basin of water at her feet. She had been tending to him for hours, her movements silent and focused. She had cleaned his wounds, set his ribs as best she could with strips of cloth, and forced sips of water between his cracked lips. He woke to find her dabbing a cool cloth on his forehead. He looked at her in the dim light of the single lantern. The fury and fear of the afternoon were gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. Their eyes met and held. There were no words to be said. Everything, the warnings, the fights, the shared meals, the rescue, the blood, it all hung in the air between them. A powerful, undeniable truth. He was no longer just a white man, and she was no longer just an Apache. They were simply a man and a woman, 2 lonely souls who had found an unlikely anchor in each other. Slowly, painfully, Jack lifted a hand and touched her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief second. He drew her closer, a slight, weak pressure. She leaned down, her long braids falling to frame his battered face. Their foreheads touched. Her breath was warm on his lips. Time seemed to stop. In the immense silence of the desert night, their mouths met. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of pure, fragile discovery. Her lips were soft, hesitant. His were bruised and tender. It was a trembling, uncertain touch, as delicate and fleeting as the whisper of wind across the dry sand. Yet it sealed a bond that both of them knew, with a terrifying certainty, would change everything. The morning after was a country of silence. When Jack woke, the sun was streaming through the unchinked gaps in the cabin walls, striping the dusty air with gold. Every muscle in his body was a dull, protesting ache. He turned his head, a sharp pain shooting through his ribs, and saw her, Tall Moon was not by his side. She was across the small room, her back to him, grinding corn on a flat stone she must have brought from her own camp. The rhythmic, scraping sound was the only thing breaking the stillness. She had not left. That fact settled in his chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He tried to sit up, and a groan escaped his lips before he could stop it. The scraping stopped. She didn't turn around immediately, but he could feel her awareness of him, a sudden tension in the set of her shoulders. After a long moment, she rose and came over, carrying a tin cup of water. She knelt beside his cot, her face an unreadable mask. "Be still," she said. Her voice was flat, the same tone she had used in the cave. It was as if the night before, the trembling kiss, had never happened. But it had. It lived in the space between them, a silent, shimmering thing. He saw it in the way she refused to meet his eyes for more than a second, her gaze darting from his bruised face to the cup in her hands. He felt it in the careful way she moved, an awkwardness that had never been there before, as if she were suddenly unsure of how her own body should occupy the space near his. She helped him drink, one of her strong hands supporting the back of his head. Her touch was impersonal, a nurse tending a patient, but he could feel a faint tremor in her fingers. He drank the water, his eyes on her face, trying to read the thoughts behind the stony facade. There was nothing. She was a locked door. "Thank you," he rasped when he was done. She gave a curt nod and went back to her grinding. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude or the tense silence of enemies. It was a heavy, charged silence, thick with unspoken questions and feelings too new and too dangerous to name. They were two strangers who had shared something profound, and now had no idea how to speak to one another in the harsh light of day. For the next 2 weeks, this became their new world. She did not leave. She moved her few belongings, a sleeping roll, a water skin, a bow and quiver, into a corner of the half-finished cabin as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And they worked. There was no discussion, no agreement. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. When Jack, his ribs still aching, struggled to lift a heavy roof beam into place, she came and took one end, lifting it with an ease that still astonished him. He would saw the logs, and she would carry them. He would work on the intricate joints for the cabin corners, and she would mix mud and grass for the chinking, her hands moving with a focused, earthy grace. They moved around each other in a kind of dance, a choreography of shared labor. Words were sparse, reserved for the necessities of the task at hand. "Hold this. A little higher." The axe is dull, but a new language was growing between them, a language of glances, gestures, and shared rhythms. He learned the way she would pause and tilt her head, listening to a sound on the wind he couldn't yet hear. She learned the weary slump of his shoulders that meant his ribs were paining him more than he would admit. He would hunt, bringing back rabbits or the occasional deer, and she would skin and prepare the meat with a swift, no-nonsense efficiency. They ate their meals by the fire, the silence between them now more comfortable, companionable. He found himself talking sometimes, filling the quiet with stories from his past, not the dark, violent parts, but small, simple things, the feel of a stampede under his horse, the taste of coffee on a frosty morning in the high plains. She would listen, her dark eyes on the flames, and sometimes, very rarely, he would be rewarded with that small, secret smile that lit her face from within. She, in turn, began to share pieces of her world. She taught him the names of the plants, which ones could be eaten, which ones could soothe a fever, which ones were poison. She showed him how to read the clouds to predict the weather, how to find water by watching the flight of the bees. She was not teaching a student, she was simply sharing knowledge, as one might share a piece of bread. Jack felt a sense of peace settle into his soul, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. He was building more than a cabin. He was building a life, a real one. with calloused hands and honest sweat. And he was not alone in it. This fierce, silent woman had become the center of his small world, a steady, powerful presence that made the loneliness of his past feel like a distant dream. He found himself watching her constantly, the way the sun caught the blue-black sheen of her hair, the sheer power in her arms as she lifted a log, the quiet focus in her eyes as she stitched a patch onto his worn-out shirt. A deep, quiet affection was growing in him, a feeling that was both exhilarating and terrifying. For Tall Moon, the days were a confusing torment of the heart. Every swing of his hammer seemed to be chipping away at the walls she had built around herself. She had spent her life cultivating a fierce independence, defining herself by her strength and her solitude. Now, she was willingly tying herself to this man and this place. She found a strange satisfaction in the simple, shared tasks, the raising of a wall, the planting of a small garden with seeds she had gathered. It was a life her mother might have lived, a life of building instead of just surviving. This feeling scared her more than any blue-coat soldier. It felt like a betrayal of her mother's memory, of her vow to never be weak, to never depend on anyone, especially not a white man. Yet, she could not bring herself to leave. When she watched Jack work, his face set in stubborn concentration, his pale blue eyes squinting against the sun, she felt a pull, a dangerous warmth that threatened to thaw the frozen grief in her soul. She would remember the look in his eyes after the fight, the way he had looked at her not as a monster or a prize, but as a person. And she would remember the trembling touch of his lips. At night, she would lie on her sleeping roll, listening to the soft sound of his breathing across the room, and a war would rage inside her. The summer deepened, and the heat became a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the valley from dawn till dusk. The air shimmered, and the rocks were too hot to touch. It was on one of these searing afternoons that the fragile peace of their world was shattered. Jack had bought a young, half-wild Mustang in town, a powerful bay that he hoped to train as his primary mount. He had been working with it for days in the new corral, a slow process of building trust. Tall Moon watched from the shade of the cabin, her hands busy mending a strap, but her attention was on the man and the horse. She saw that Jack was tired, his movements a little slower in the oppressive heat. She saw the way the horse's eyes rolled, its skin twitching, irritated by the heat and the flies. It happened in an instant. A rattlesnake, seeking the shade of the corral fence, buzzed its warning, a dry, angry sound. The Mustang, already on edge, exploded. It didn't just buck. It twisted in the air with a violent, panicked fury. Jack, caught by surprise, was thrown clear. He hit the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud, his head snapping back against a fence post. And then he lay still, utterly, unnaturally still. The world stopped for Tall Moon. The heat, the buzzing of the flies, the panicked snorting of the horse, it all faded into a roaring silence in her ears. She saw him lying there, a broken doll in the dust, and something inside her that had been frozen for 15 years finally broke. Jack! The name was a scream, ripped from the depths of her soul. She was running before she was even aware of her own feet moving, the mending falling from her lap. She vaulted the corral fence, her heart a wild, frantic bird beating against her ribs. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his still form, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she would find. His face was pale under its tan, a trickle of blood seeping from his hair into the dust. His eyes were closed. He wasn't breathing. No, she whispered. The word, a prayer, a denial, a desperate plea to the spirits of the land. No, 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 no. She put a trembling hand on his chest, searching for the rise and fall, for the beat of his heart. Nothing. He was gone. The man who had looked at her with kindness, who had made her laugh, who had kissed her with such gentle reverence. Gone. The fragile, beautiful thing they had been building together. Shattered. And then the tears came. A single hot tear slid down her cheek, then another and another. A great, shuddering sob shook her entire frame, a sound of such profound, wrenching grief it seemed to tear her apart. She, who had not wept at her mother's death, who had faced down wolves and armed men without flinching, now knelt in the dust and wept for this foolish, stubborn white man. She collapsed over his chest, her tears soaking the front of his dusty shirt, her body convulsing with a pain far greater than any physical wound. She had let him in. She had let herself feel, and the price was this unbearable agony. It was the wetness on his shirt, the shuddering weight of her body against his. That brought him back. A flicker of consciousness returned, a slow, painful climb out of a deep black well. His head felt like it had been split open with an axe. He took a ragged, involuntary breath, a gasp that turned into a cough. Tall Moon froze. She felt the slight movement beneath her, heard the faint sound. She lifted her head, her face streaked with dust and tears, and looked down. His pale blue eyes were open, unfocused and clouded with pain, but they were open. He was looking at her. He saw the tears on her cheeks, the raw agony in her expression. A faint, weak smile touched his lips. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, broken whisper. Never seen a woman as strong as you," he rasped, each word an effort. His gaze softened, and the weak smile became something more, something tender and profound. "But I just wish I could be weak with you, for once." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't her strength he wanted. It was her strength he wanted to rest in. He wasn't asking her to be less. He was asking for permission to be less himself, to lay down the burden of his own strength, his own past, at her feet. He was offering her his vulnerability, the one thing a man like him would never give away lightly. It was the most profound declaration of trust she had ever known. All the fight went out of her. The war inside her ceased. In that moment, there was no past, no future, no races, no ghosts. There was only him, this man, broken and bleeding in the dust for her. She didn't speak. She slid her arms under him, one beneath his shoulders, one under his knees, and lifted him as if he were a child. His head lolled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow. She carried him out of the hot, unforgiving sun and into the cool dimness of the cabin they had built together. She laid him gently on his cot and tended to his head wound, her hands no longer trembling, but filled with a new and resolute purpose. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering her name sometimes. The sun began to set, painting the valley in hues of orange and deep violet, and a hot, dry wind began to blow, whispering through the pines. Night fell, but it brought no coolness. The air in the cabin was thick and hot, smelling of dust and sweat and blood. She sat beside him, bathing his face with a cool cloth. He was awake now, his eyes clear and lucid, watching her every move. The silence was back, but it was a different silence still. It was the silence of the desert before a storm, a stillness humming with a powerful, inevitable energy. He reached out and took the cloth from her hand, his fingers closing over hers. He didn't let go. He tugged gently, pulling her down toward him. "Tall Moon," he whispered, his voice still hoarse. She leaned over him, her face close to his, her long hair falling around them like a dark curtain, shutting out the rest of the world. This time, there was no hesitation. This time, it was not for rescue, not for comfort. It was for a need so deep and so powerful, it felt like the very pull of the earth itself. His kiss was no longer tentative. It was desperate and claiming. The kiss of a man who had stared into the abyss and come back. Her response was just as fierce, a surrendering of all her defenses, a lifetime of pent-up loneliness and unspoken longing pouring out of her. It was a fever, a fire that consumed them both in the hot, dark room. Clothes were shed with clumsy, urgent hands. There were no soft words, no gentle caresses. It was a raw, silent, desperate collision of two solitary souls. It was the rough scrape of his beard against her skin, the surprising softness of her lips. It was the hard muscle of her back under his hands, the tangle of their limbs on the narrow cot. They moved together in the sweltering darkness, their bodies speaking a language of pure, unvarnished need. It was a claiming and a surrender, a finding and a being found. Their breath came in ragged gasps. Their hands clutched and held, seeking an anchor in the storm of sensation. Two people drowning in each other, and for the first time in their lives, not wanting to be saved. Later, they lay tangled together, slick with sweat, the sound of their harsh breathing slowly quieting. The hot desert wind blew through the open doorway, a restless, sighing sound. He fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, his head resting in the curve of her shoulder, his hand still holding hers. Tall Moon lay awake, staring into the darkness, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against her side. She had never felt anything like this, a sense of rightness, of belonging, so profound it terrified her. She had allowed herself to be weak. She had rested in his vulnerability, and in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew existed. But as the first pale light of dawn began to creep into the cabin, the ghosts returned. The face of her mother, the smell of smoke, the cold blue of the soldiers' coats, the whispers of her own people, the sneering face of Silas Croft. This small cabin, which had felt like a universe in the night, now felt like a cage. This feeling of peace felt like a lie. She was Tall Moon, the warrior, the mountain monster. Her home was the high ridges and the silent canyons. Her path was one of solitude, paved with the stones of her past. She could not walk this new path. To do so would be to kill the girl who had survived, the woman she had forced herself to become. Carefully, so as not to wake him, she slipped her hand from his. She stood and looked down at him, his face peaceful and unguarded in sleep. A terrible ache filled her chest. She dressed silently in the gray light. She found a piece of charcoal from the fire pit and a smooth, white piece of birch bark. Her hand was steady as she wrote the simple, brutal words. She placed the bark on the small table beside his cot, where he would see it when he woke. She gave him one last, long look, memorizing the lines of his face. Then she turned, and without a sound, she walked out of the cabin and melted back into the mountains that claimed her. When Jack woke hours later, the sun was high and the cabin was empty and silent. He called her name, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. Then he saw it, the piece of white bark on the table. He reached for it, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. There were only 8 words, written in a strong, clear hand. I am of the mountains. We do not belong together. The note was a ghost, a whisper of charcoal on bark that screamed a final, deafening truth. I am of the mountains. We do not belong together. Jack read the words once, then twice, then a dozen times, as if staring at them long enough would change their meaning, would conjure her back out of the thin morning air. But the cabin remained empty. The only sound was the buzzing of a fly against the new, unfinished window frame. Her absence was not an emptiness. It was a physical presence, a crushing weight that settled on his chest and made it hard to breathe. The cabin they had built together became a tomb, each lovingly placed log a monument to his foolishness. The stone she used for grinding corn sat by the hearth, and he couldn't bring himself to move it. The small garden they had planted began to wither under the relentless sun, its wilting leaves a mirror of his own spirit. The first week was a haze of disbelief. He would wake for a single, blissful second and expect to see her, her dark braids catching the morning light. Then memory would crash down on him, a physical blow. He rode out, searching for her, calling her name until his throat was raw. The only answer, the mocking echo from the Red Rock canyons. She was gone. She had vanished back into the land that had birthed her, leaving no more trace than a hawk's shadow passing over the ground. The disbelief curdled into a bitter, helpless anger. An anger at her for leaving, at himself for believing, at the world for showing him a glimpse of peace only to snatch it away. But the anger had no target, and it soon burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of despair. That was when he started drinking. He rode into Border Ridge, a ghost of a man, and bought 2 bottles of the cheapest, rawest whiskey the saloon had to offer. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't meet the curious, contemptuous stares of the townsfolk. He took the bottles back to his valley of ghosts and began the systematic process of trying to drown his own soul. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun he no longer cared to see. He stopped working on the cabin. The corral gates sagged on a broken hinge. Weeds grew bold and thick in the untended garden. He would sit by his cold fire pit, the bottle in his hand, and stare at the great cottonwood tree, her grandfather tree. He would remember her standing there, a fierce and beautiful shield, and the memory was a knife in his gut. The whiskey didn't make the pain go away. It only blurred the edges, sinking him deeper into a bog of self-pity and inertia. He was no longer the man who had wanted to build a home. He was just another broken man in a broken land, waiting for the end. It arrived not as a quiet fading, but as a uniformed man on a tired-looking army horse. He was a corporal, young and officious, with a sunburnt nose and a leather dispatch case. He looked around at the neglected homestead and the unshaven, hollow-eyed man who stumbled out of the cabin with distaste. "You Jack Rowan?" the corporal asked. His tone clipped. Jack nodded, his head throbbing. The corporal pulled a folded document from his case. "Official notice from the United States Army, acting on behalf of the Transcontinental Railroad Company, by authority of the territorial governor. All land claims in this sector, designated Verde Valley Survey 7, are hereby declared null and void. The land is being appropriated for the construction of a new railway line." Jack stared at him, the words slow to penetrate the alcoholic fog. "What? You're being evicted," the corporal said, simplifying with evident satisfaction. "The railroad is coming through. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. Any structures or property remaining after that time will be cleared." He paused, then added another detail as if it were an afterthought. "Furthermore, for the safety and security of the construction crews, a general order has been issued for the removal of all remaining Apache bands from the surrounding territories. They are to be rounded up and transported to the reservation at San Carlos." The corporal's voice faded. All Jack could hear was a roaring in his ears. "Rounded up! Transported!" He saw his mother's face, a memory of smoke and shouting and the bright, terrible flash of brass buttons on blue uniforms. The words were a bucket of ice water thrown on the embers of his soul. His own loss, his own pathetic, whiskey-soaked grief, suddenly seemed small and selfish. They were coming for her people. They were coming to finish the job they had started all those years ago. Something shifted inside him. The drunk, broken man who had been sitting in the dirt waiting to die was gone. In his place stood the man she had seen, the man she had saved, the man she had trusted with her weakness. A cold, clear purpose settled over him. "When?" Jack asked, his voice a low rasp. All trace of the drunkard gone. The corporal was taken aback by the sudden change. "The sweeps have already begun in the high country. They'll be working their way down to the foothills over the next few weeks." He handed the eviction notice to Jack, turned his horse, and rode away, eager to be gone from this desolate place. Jack stood there, the official paper clutched in his hand. He looked at the half-finished cabin, the sagging corral, the silent, empty valley. It wasn't his land. It had never been. It was hers, and they were coming to take it all. The next morning, Jack shaved for the first time in a month, using a piece of broken mirror. The face that looked back at him was gaunt and haggard, but the pale blue eyes were clear and hard as winter ice. He cleaned his rifle and his pistol, his movements precise and economical. He poured the last of the whiskey onto the thirsty ground, Then he saddled his horse and rode for Border Ridge. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the general store and stood on the boardwalk, waiting. It wasn't long before a crowd gathered. His sudden reappearance, clean and sober, was a source of great curiosity. Silas Croft was there, holding court with his ranch hands, the same men who had beaten Jack in this very street. Jack waited until the street was full of people. Then he stepped forward. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice carrying in the quiet air. All eyes turned to him. "The army was out to my place yesterday," he began. "They're taking the land, all of it, for the railroad." A murmur went through the crowd. Some of them were small homesteaders, their claims just as precarious as his. "They're kicking us all out, but that's not the worst of it. They've started rounding up the Apache, sweeping them from their homes, taking them to San Carlos." A man in the crowd spat. "Good riddance." "They're people!" Jack's voice cracked like a whip. "They were born here. This land is more theirs than it is ours. They're women, children, old men, and the army is treating them like cattle." Silas Croft stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "Listen to him. Rowan's gone full savage. I told you he was an Indian lover. What's the matter? Rowan, worried they'll take that giant squaw you've been keeping?" The crowd laughed. The sound was ugly. "This isn't about one person," Jack said, his eyes locking with Croft's. "This is about what's right. This railroad, your land, Croft, this whole town. It's all built on land that was stolen. And now they're coming to steal the people, too. Are we just going to stand by and watch it happen?" "You're a traitor to your own kind, Rowan," Croft snarled. "You'd side with a pack of murdering savages over honest white folk." "I'd side with a rattlesnake before I'd side with you, Croft," Jack shot back. "I've been a lot of things in my life, a hired gun, a drunk, but I've never been a party to kidnapping women and children. That's a line I won't cross." He turned to the crowd. "I know most of you hate them, fear them, but just think for a minute. This time it's them. Next time, when the railroad wants more, or a big rancher like Croft decides your little homestead is in his way, who do you think they'll come for then?" His words fell on deaf ears. He could see it in their hard, closed faces. He was an outcast, a pariah, a white traitor, defeated. He turned to leave, when a quiet voice stopped him. "He's right, you know." The voice belonged to an old man sitting in a chair outside the smithy. His name was Jedediah, a former army scout who had been put out to pasture years ago. He had a grizzled beard, one milky eye, and a deep, abiding hatred for the modern army and the politicians who gave it its orders. Jedediah hobbled over to Jack. "They ain't soldiers, son," he said in a low voice, for Jack's ears only. "They're bullies in uniform. I seen it before. San Carlos ain't a reservation. It's a prison camp, a place to die." Hope, a fragile, desperate thing, flickered in Jack's chest. "They've started the sweeps in the high country." Jedediah nodded grimly. "Heard the same. The main company is camped out by the old mission ruins, using it as a holding pen." He looked at Jack, his good eyes sharp and appraising. "You got a death wish, son?" "I've got to do something," Jack said simply. "She's up there, ain't she?" Jedediah guessed. "That tall Apache woman." Jack didn't have to answer. "Knew it," the old scout grunted. "A woman like that, she wouldn't be taken easy." He paused, then made a decision. "Come with me. We'll talk." Jedediah's information was grim. A band of Apache had been cornered in a box canyon 2 days ago. They had put up a fight, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. Among the captured was a tall, fierce woman who had fought like a demon, trying to give the women and children time to escape. Tall Moon. She was now at the army camp, slated to be shipped out on the first transport wagon. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, 2 riders left the lights of Border Ridge behind. One was a broken-down old scout, the other a man with nothing left to lose. Their plan was simple, reckless, and almost certain to fail. The army camp was a circle of wagons and tents around the crumbling adobe walls of the old Spanish mission. Sentries walked the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the firelight. In the center of the ruins, in what used to be the chapel courtyard, was a makeshift stockade. It was filled with the silent, huddled shapes of the captured Apache. Jack and Jedediah left their horses tethered in a deep arroyo and approached on foot, moving like shadows through the scrub brush. Jedediah, using his knowledge of army routine, led them to a blind spot in the patrol route, near the supply wagons. "Guard changes in 10 minutes, the old man whispered. "That's your window. I'll create a diversion on the far side. Once you're in, you're on your own. Get her and get out. Meet me back at the arroyo." "What kind of diversion?" Jack asked. Jedediah's good eye twinkled. "The army's mules are mighty fond of their oats, and mighty scared of fire." Jack waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his damaged ribs. He heard a sudden commotion from the far side of the camp, shouting, a panicked braying of mules. As the nearest sentry turned to look, Jack slipped over a low section of the adobe wall and into the shadows of the mission. He moved quickly, a ghost in the darkness, his old mercenary skills coming back to him. He found the stockade. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and a padlock. He looked at the huddled figures inside. He saw her immediately. She was not huddled. She was standing, her back to the wall, her face turned up toward the indifferent stars. Even as a prisoner, she looked proud and unbroken. He hissed her name, Tall Moon. Her head whipped around. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw him through the wooden slats. He put a finger to his lips, then got to work on the lock. He used a thick piece of wire he'd taken from the smithy, his fingers working with a desperate haste. It felt like an eternity, but the lock finally clicked open. He swung the gate open a few inches. "Come on," he whispered urgently. She was at the gate in an instant. They slipped out into the shadows, the chaos of Jedediah's diversion growing louder. An alarm bell began to ring. They ran, ducking behind crumbling walls, their feet silent on the dusty ground. They were almost to the outer wall when a squad of soldiers, alerted to the breakout, rounded a corner, their lanterns cutting through the darkness. They were trapped. The soldiers raised their rifles. In that split second, Jack didn't think. He acted. He shoved Tall Moon hard, pushing her back into the deep shadow of a collapsed archway. "Go!" he yelled. He stepped out into the light, drawing their fire. A rifle cracked, and a white-hot pain exploded in his back. The force of the bullet threw him forward, and he fell to his knees. He saw Tall Moon's horrified face in the archway. Then the world began to spin and fade to black. He was being dragged. He was in the forest, the smell of pine needles filling his senses. He could hear shouting and gunfire in the distance, but it was growing fainter. He looked up and saw her face, a mask of grim determination, as she pulled him deeper into the woods. She found a shallow ravine and half-carried, half-dragged him into its cover. She laid him down gently, her hands searching for the wound. When she pulled her hand away from his back, it was covered in dark, sticky blood. He was dying. He knew it. The cold was spreading through him, a deep, final chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He looked up at her beautiful, fierce face, now twisted with a grief that was more terrible than any physical pain. He tried to smile, a gurgling, "Bloody affair." "This time," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "This time, I really am weak." A sound was torn from Tall Moon's throat, a sound of absolute, animal despair. It was not a cry or a sob, but a raw, keening howl of a soul being ripped in two. She gathered him into her arms, holding him tight against her as if she could force the life to stay in his body through sheer will. The sounds of pursuit, the distant shouts and sporadic gunfire, echoed through the dark forest. A closing circle of death. She held him, her face buried in his hair, rocking him back and forth as his life bled out into the cold, unforgiving earth of her homeland. Time in the Arizona Territory did not heal all wounds, but it covered them in the patient dust of seasons. The autumn that followed the disastrous raid on the army camp was a season of blood-colored leaves and long, cold nights. Winter came, burying the mountains in a rare, silent blanket of white. And then, as it always did, the land drew a long, slow breath, and it was spring. The creek in Jack's Valley ran high and clear with snowmelt, and the great cottonwood, the grandfather tree, put forth a million tiny, tender green leaves. It was on a bright spring morning, when the last of the chill had left the air, that border ridge saw a ghost. A woman walked down the muddy main street, her head held high, her stride long and purposeful. It was her height that made people look twice, and her face that made them stop and stare in stunned disbelief. It was the Apache giantess, the mountain monster. But it was not the same woman they had known. The buckskins were gone. The bow and quiver were gone. The twin braids, black as a raven's wing, were still there. But they fell over the shoulders of a simple, high-collared calico dress, the kind a homesteader's wife might wear. It was clean and well-mended, but it fit her awkwardly, a cage of cloth on a body made for the wild freedom of the mountains. She carried a small, heavy-looking leather purse in one hand. Her face was as impassive as ever, but the cold, hard fire in her eyes had been banked. In its place was a quiet, settled resolve, a calm so deep it was more unsettling than her old fury. She walked directly to the land office, ignoring the whispers and the wide-eyed stares that followed her like a cloud of dust. Bidler, the land agent, saw her coming through his grimy window, and a wave of sweat broke out on his fat neck. He was halfway to hiding under his desk when she opened the door. The small bell above it gave a cheerful, inappropriate jingle. "I am here to purchase the claim in Verde Valley," she said. Her voice was the same low, clear instrument, but it held no threat. It was the voice of business. Bidler swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. That land's been seized. Railroad property. It ain't for sale." "The railroad survey has been changed," she stated, as if correcting a child. "The final line will pass 2 miles to the north. This valley is no longer required. It is surplus land to be sold by the company to recoup its costs." Bidler stared at her. How in God's name did she know that? The official notice had only arrived yesterday. She seemed to read his mind. "I have spoken with the chief surveyor." She opened the leather purse and a cascade of gold coins tumbled onto his desk. The sound, a bright, authoritative clatter in the dusty room. There was more than enough. Far more. "I will pay the company's price, and I will pay the filing fees. The deed is to be in the name of Jack Rowan." The name hung in the air. Jack Rowan, the traitor, the dead man. "Rowan's dead," Bidler stammered. "He was killed in that breakout at the mission." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face, a deep, weary sadness. "He is not dead," she said quietly. "The deed will be in his name." The law was the law, and gold was gold. Bidler, sweating and confused, filled out the paperwork. The land that had been bought with blood money was now bought back with gold from an unknown source. The woman who had fought to keep Jack off the land now legally secured it for him. She took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her purse. She turned and walked out of the office, leaving Bidler to stare at the pile of gold, wondering if he had just done business with a spirit. The town watched her go, not east toward the reservation, but north toward the very valley they all thought was now empty. The story of her appearance, of the gold, of her claim about Jack Rowan, became the talk of the town. Most believed she was mad with grief, a ghost haunting the place where her white lover had died. Silas Croft declared loudly in the saloon that the woman was a menace and the land should have been burned to the ground. But no one went out to the valley to challenge her. The memory of her dismantling 3 armed men was still fresh and sharp. And so they watched and they whispered, and they wondered. They saw her, from a distance, working the land. She moved with a relentless, tireless energy. She finished the cabin, chinking the walls and setting a proper door. She repaired the corral. She cleared the land. Not for cattle, but for something else, digging rows of neat, perfect holes in the rich earth by the creek. Then a wagon came, not from Border Ridge, but from the east, from the farming settlements in the next territory. It was loaded with saplings, their roots bundled in burlap, and the people of Border Ridge watched from the high ridges, through spyglasses, as the Apache giantess, the mountain monster, planted an apple orchard. It was the act of a settler, of someone planning to stay for 50 years. It made no sense. It was Jedediah, the old scout, who knew the truth. It was he whom Tall Moon had found that terrible night, a phantom emerging from the woods, her clothes soaked in Jack's blood. She had not howled in grief and let him die. Her grief had been a catalyst, a fire that had burned away the last of her hesitation. She had used her knowledge, the knowledge passed down from her mother, to staunch the bleeding with a poultice of yarrow and spider webs. She had used the last of her strength to get him to the old scout's hidden shack, a place the army would never find. The recovery was a long, brutal journey through a hell of fever and pain. The army doctor they had secretly brought from a distant fort had taken the bullet out, but had given Jack no chance of survival. His left arm was paralyzed, the nerves severed by the bullet's path. The infection had nearly taken him a dozen times. Through it all, Tall Moon had been a constant presence. She had nursed him, cleaned his wounds, forced broth and herbal teas between his lips, and fought for his life with a ferocity that awed even the grizzled old scout. She had willed him back to life. When he was finally strong enough to be moved, she brought him home, back to the valley, back to the cabin they had built. It was Silas Croft, his curiosity and hatred finally getting the better of him, who confirmed the rumors. He rode out one afternoon, a rifle across his saddle, to see for himself what the squaw was up to. He topped the ridge overlooking the valley and reined in his horse, his jaw dropping in disbelief. Down below, the new apple saplings stood in neat rows, and sitting on a bench in the shade of the cabin porch was a man. He was thin and pale, his left arm held in a permanent, stiff sling against his chest, but it was unmistakably Jack Rowan. As Croft watched, Tall Moon came out of the cabin. She handed Jack a cup, and then sat on the porch steps at his feet, leaning her head back against his good knee. Jack's right hand came down and rested on her hair. The gesture was one of such easy, quiet intimacy that it was more shocking to Croft than any display of passion. They were not a master and a pet, not a captor and a prisoner. They were a man and a woman, at home. Croft turned his horse and rode away, a sour, defeated taste in his mouth. Their life in the valley settled into a new rhythm, a quiet partnership that defied the world's expectations. He was no longer the strong, capable man who could build and fight and tame wild horses. He couldn't swing an axe, couldn't saddle his own horse, couldn't even fire a rifle with any accuracy. The vibrant energy that had defined him was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful stillness. And she, in turn, was no longer just the warrior. She was the builder, the planter, the protector. Her physical strength, once a barrier that set her apart, was now the engine of their shared life. She plowed the field for the orchard, her broad shoulders straining against the harness of a mule-drawn plow. She hunted for their meat, her aim with her bow as true as ever. She was the hands, and he, in many ways, was the head. He learned to do things one-handed. He learned to mend harnesses, to sharpen tools, to read the complex government pamphlets on animal husbandry and crop rotation that Jedediah brought them. His mind, once occupied with survival and escape, was now free to plan, to dream. It was his idea to plant the apples. "It's a future, Tall Moon," he had said one evening, his voice still weak. "Something that will be here long after we're gone." She had simply nodded and made it happen. At night, he would read to her from a worn copy of Shakespeare that had been in his saddlebags for years, his voice soft in the lantern light. She, in turn, would take him outside and teach him the names of the stars in her own language, telling him the ancient stories of the sky. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't talk about what they were to each other. They didn't need to. The words were there in every shared meal, in every quiet evening, in the simple, unspoken fact that he was here, and she was here, and they were together. The people of Border Ridge, for their part, eventually settled into a state of grudging acceptance. They kept their distance, but the open hostility faded into a kind of myth-making. They no longer called her the mountain monster. They had a new name for her. When they spoke of her, which was rarely, they called her the lame cowboy's wife. The term was meant to be insulting, a way of diminishing them both. But in its own crude way, it was a recognition of the truth. They were a unit, a strange, mismatched pair who belonged only to each other. They were never seen to hold hands or embrace in public, but the bond between them was as solid and real as the mountains that sheltered them. Years passed. The apple saplings grew into young, strong trees. The first blossoms appeared, a cloud of pink and white against the red rock of the canyon walls. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jack sat on the bench on the porch, his gaze on the young orchard. The setting sun cast a warm, golden light over the valley that was now truly their home. His face was older, etched with the lines of pain and peace. His paralyzed arm was a constant reminder of all he had lost, but his good eye was clear. He heard the soft tread of her moccasins on the porch boards behind him. She didn't speak. She came and stood behind the bench, and then she sat, not beside him, but on the bench behind him, straddling it. She pressed her chest against his back and wrapped her arms around him, her strong hands lacing together over his heart. He leaned back into her embrace, a comfortable, familiar gesture. Her chin came to rest on his shoulder, and her long braid fell forward, brushing against his cheek. They sat like that for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen, two parts of a whole. Silhouetted against the dying light, he could feel the steady, powerful beat of her heart against his back. She finally broke the silence, her voice a low, soft whisper, her breath warm against his neck. "It wasn't because you were strong," she said, the words a quiet revelation, the final piece of their story falling into place. "It was that you were weak enough to love me." Thank you for listening to our story here at the campfire. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So drop a comment down below and let's connect. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales from the Old West. And be sure to share your thoughts on Jack and Tall Moon's journey.